In 1908, a seemingly ordinary family photograph captured something extraordinary, something that would haunt the Henderson family for generations. What started as a joyful Christmas dinner ended with a discovery that defied explanation, an extra hand resting on a plate belonging to no one in the room. This is the story of a mystery that was never solved, a presence that refused to be forgotten, and a family dinner that should never have happened. If you enjoy mysteries that blur the line between reality and the unexplainable, leave a like. It really helps the channel grow. December 24th, 1908. Snow blanketed the streets of Rochester, New York, transforming the industrial city into something resembling a Christmas card. Inside the Henderson residence on East Avenue, warmth radiated from the kitchen where Margaret Henderson orchestrated the evening's feast with military precision. The house smelled of roasted goose, cinnamon, and pine. Garlands draped across the mantelpiece, and a modest Christmas tree stood in the corner of the dining room, decorated with handmade ornaments and flickering candles that cast dancing shadows on the wallpapered walls. For the first time in 3 years, the entire Henderson family was together. Thomas Henderson, the patriarch, had worked double shifts at the Eastman Kodak factory to afford this gathering. His weathered hands bore the stains of chemical processing, but tonight they would hold nothing heavier than silverware. Beside him sat his wife Margaret, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of seeing her family complete. Their eldest son, William, had traveled from Boston, where he worked as a clerk in a law firm. At 28, he carried himself with the studious air of someone who spent more time with books than people. His wire-rimmed glasses constantly slid down his nose, which he pushed back up with a habitual gesture that had annoyed his younger siblings since childhood. Catherine, their only daughter, sat across from William. At 25, she had recently become engaged to a banker's son, though her parents disapproved of his family's ostentatious wealth. Still, tonight was about unity, not conflict, so Thomas and Margaret kept their concerns to themselves. The youngest, James, barely 21, had returned from a year working the railroads out west. His face had hardened, his hands calloused, and he spoke less than he used to. Something about the prairies had changed him, though he refused to discuss what. The dining table groaned under the weight of the meal. A perfectly golden goose occupied the center, surrounded by roasted potatoes, glazed carrots, fresh bread still warm from the oven, cranberry sauce, and Margaret's famous apple pie waiting on the sideboard. "Before we eat," Thomas announced, standing with some effort, "I want to commemorate this moment. William, you brought that new camera, didn't you?" William nodded, retrieving the Kodak Brownie from his travel bag. Photography was still a novelty for most families, expensive and complicated, but William had saved for months to purchase the device. He'd been practicing, learning the temperamental art of exposure times and flash powder. "Everyone, positions!" Margaret called out, fussing with her collar and smoothing her dress. "Thomas, sit properly. Catherine, fix your hair. James, for heaven's sake, smile." They arranged themselves around the table in a tableau of domestic bliss. Thomas at the head, Margaret to his right, William and Catherine on one side, James on the other. The plates were set, the food displayed, hands positioned naturally as if caught mid-meal. William set up the camera on its tripod, measuring the distance, adjusting the lens. The flash powder sat ready in its tray. "Everyone hold perfectly still," he instructed. "Don't move for at least 3 seconds after the flash, or you'll blur." The family froze, wearing their best Sunday smiles. Catherine's hand rested near her water glass. James's fingers drummed once on the table before stilling. Margaret's expression radiated maternal pride. William squeezed the shutter release. The flash powder ignited with a brilliant white burst, filling the room with acrid smoke and temporary blindness. Everyone blinked, rubbed their eyes, and laughed at the momentary discomfort. "Perfect," William declared, carefully removing the film. "I'll have this developed next week when I return to Boston." We'll have a beautiful memory of tonight." They ate with enthusiasm, conversation flowing easily after the initial awkwardness of reunion. Thomas told stories about the factory's expansion. Margaret shared neighborhood gossip. Catherine described her wedding plans in exhaustive detail. James remained mostly quiet, offering occasional comments about life out west, though his stories felt carefully edited, as if he were leaving out crucial details. The evening progressed without incident. They sang carols around the piano, opened modest gifts, and by midnight everyone retired to their rooms, exhausted but content. It had been, by all accounts, a perfect Christmas. William returned to Boston 3 days later, taking the undeveloped film with him. He'd found a photographer's shop near his boarding house that offered developing services for a reasonable price. A week later, he picked up the photograph, paid his 50 cents, and walked back to his room without looking at it. That evening, sitting at his small desk by lamplight, William finally examined the Christmas portrait. The image had captured the scene beautifully, the table laden with food, his family's faces clear and smiling, the decorations visible in the background. Then he noticed something wrong. There, resting on the plate directly in front of his father's setting, was a hand. Not his father's hand. Both of Thomas's hands were visible, one holding a fork, the other resting on the table's edge. This was a different hand entirely, pale, slender, with long fingers that seemed to be reaching for the food. A woman's hand, judging by its delicate structure. William's breath caught. He held the photograph closer to the lamp, squinting. Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a double exposure, some error in the developing process, but no, the hand was too clear, too defined. It cast a faint shadow on the plate beneath it. Most disturbing of all, there was no arm attached. The hand simply appeared at the wrist, as if someone invisible had reached through the fabric of reality to touch their Christmas dinner. If you're enjoying this mystery so far, leave a like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you think this hand could be. William didn't sleep that night. He sat at his desk until dawn, studying the photograph from every angle, searching for rational explanations that refused to materialize. By morning, he'd convinced himself he needed to return to Rochester immediately. The train journey felt interminable. William kept the photograph in his jacket pocket, pulling it out repeatedly to confirm he hadn't imagined the anomaly. Each time, the hand remained, ghostly pale against the white china, fingers slightly curved as if about to grasp something. He arrived at the Henderson home on a gray January afternoon. His mother answered the door, surprise and concern crossing her face. "William, we weren't expecting you. Is everything all right? I need to speak with everyone," he said, stepping inside and removing his snow-dusted coat. "Where's Father?" Thomas emerged from his study, pipe in hand. "Son, what brings you back so soon?" William pulled out the photograph. "This." The family gathered in the parlor as William explained what he'd discovered. He handed the photograph to his father, watching Thomas's face pale as understanding dawned. "That's impossible," Thomas whispered. "There must be some mistake." Margaret took the photograph next, her hand trembling slightly. She studied it in silence before passing it to Catherine, who gasped audibly. James was the last to look, and his reaction was the most telling. His face went completely blank, all color draining away. "James," William pressed, "do you recognize something?" The youngest Henderson brother stood abruptly, walking to the window. He stared out at the snow-covered street for a long moment before speaking. "We should leave this alone." "Leave it alone," William's voice rose. "There's an unexplainable hand in our family photograph. How can we possibly leave it alone?" "Because some things are better left buried," James said quietly. Margaret stood, her voice sharp. "James Henderson, what do you know about this?" James turned, conflict evident in his expression. Finally, he sighed. "When I was working the railroads out west, I met an old conductor. He told stories about this house, about the family that lived here before us. There was an incident. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. What kind of incident? Thomas demanded. James sat back down, suddenly looking much older than his 21 years. The previous owners were the Whitmore family. They lived here for nearly 20 years. In December 1896, they had a daughter named Eleanor. She was 18, engaged to be married that spring. He paused, gathering his thoughts. On Christmas Eve, there was an accident. Eleanor was helping prepare dinner when she collapsed. The doctors called it heart failure, sudden and inexplicable. She died right there in the dining room, apparently reaching for her plate as she fell. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Catherine had gone completely pale. The family was devastated, James continued. They buried her 3 days later and moved out within a month. The house sat empty for 2 years before we bought it. The conductor said the Whitmores never spoke of that Christmas again. It destroyed them. William studied the photograph again with new understanding. And you think this hand belongs to Eleanor Whitmore? I think, James said carefully, that we celebrated Christmas dinner in the exact spot where a young woman died 12 years ago. Maybe something remembered. Thomas stood, agitated. This is ridiculous. There has to be a scientific explanation. Photography is a chemical process, not magic. William, could this be a double exposure, some error in the developing? William shook his head. I considered that, but look at the way the hand interacts with the plate. There's a shadow. The fingers are in front of the food. A double exposure would create a transparent overlay, not this level of physical integration. Then the photographer made a mistake, Thomas insisted. Added it somehow as a joke or... Father, William interrupted gently, the photographer never saw us. I took this photograph myself, developed it at a professional shop and picked it up sealed. No one else touched it. The implications hung heavy in the air. Catherine broke the silence with a trembling question. What do we do now? We find out more about Eleanor Whitmore, William declared. If there's a connection between her death and this photograph, we need to understand it. James, can you take me to speak with that conductor? James shook his head. He died last fall, pneumonia. Then we'll find other sources, William said firmly. The Whitmores must have left records, neighbors who remember them. Father, you know people at the city offices. Can you access property records, death certificates? Thomas nodded slowly. I suppose I can make inquiries, discreetly. Over the following days, the Henderson family became amateur investigators. Thomas obtained Eleanor Whitmore's death certificate from the city clerk's office. Cause of death listed as sudden cardiac failure. Margaret spoke with elderly neighbors who remembered the Whitmores, gathering fragments of information about the family's tragedy. What they learned painted a picture of profound loss. Eleanor had been the Whitmores' only child, bright and beloved, planning a spring wedding to her childhood sweetheart. Her death had been completely unexpected. No prior illness, no warning signs. One moment she was laughing and helping set the Christmas table, the next, she'd collapsed. The most disturbing detail came from Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down. She remembered visiting the Whitmores on Christmas Day, bringing food to the grieving family. Poor Ruth Whitmore, Mrs. Patterson recalled, her voice quavering with age. She kept saying Eleanor had been so happy about the dinner, so excited to have everyone together. Ruth found her on the floor, one hand still reaching toward her empty plate, as if she'd been trying to serve herself when death took her. William felt ice in his veins. In the photograph, the mysterious hand reached toward a plate in exactly the same position Eleanor would have occupied at the table. What had they captured that Christmas night? And more importantly, what did it want? William's investigation consumed him. He took a leave from his position in Boston, much to his employer's displeasure, and set up a makeshift research station in the Henderson study. The walls became covered with notes, timeline charts, and copies of documents he'd obtained from various sources. The death certificate was just the beginning. Through the Rochester Public Library's newspaper archives, William found Eleanor Whitmore's obituary in the December 27, 1896 edition of the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. The notice was brief but heartfelt, describing her as a young woman of exceptional character and bright promise, taken too soon from those who loved her most. But it was a smaller article, published 2 days later, that caught William's attention. Buried on page 6 was a short piece titled "Mysterious Death Investigated." According to the report, the police had briefly looked into Eleanor's death due to its unusual circumstances. A family friend had suggested the possibility of poisoning. Though the claim was quickly dismissed, the coroner had found no evidence of foul play, and the matter was closed. Poisoning. The word echoed in William's mind. Could Eleanor's death have been something other than natural causes? He needed to find the Whitmores. After Eleanor's death, the family had vanished from Rochester society completely. Thomas's contacts at the city offices revealed that the Whitmores had sold the house in February 1897 for significantly less than market value. Desperate to leave, willing to take a loss. The trail went cold for days until Margaret discovered something unexpected. While cleaning out the attic, a task she'd avoided for years, she found a small wooden box hidden beneath loose floorboards. Inside were personal items: a tarnished silver locket, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and a small journal with a cracked leather cover. The journal belonged to Eleanor Whitmore. William handled it carefully, aware he was holding something intensely private. The entries spanned from January 1896 to December 23rd, one day before her death. Eleanor's handwriting was elegant and precise, her thoughts articulated with the earnestness of youth. The early entries chronicled ordinary life, social calls, church activities, wedding preparations. But as William read deeper, a darker pattern emerged. Eleanor had been troubled by something, though she never explicitly named what. March 15th, 1896. I saw her again today in the market. She stared at me with such hatred. I've done nothing to deserve such enmity, yet she looks at me as if I've committed some terrible wrong. May 3rd, 1896. Mother says I'm being dramatic, that she's simply a bitter woman with an unfortunate disposition. But the way she watches our house, standing across the street in the evenings, it frightens me. July 22nd, 1896. Thomas proposed. I'm so happy I could burst. Mother is already planning the wedding. We'll marry in the spring just after Easter. Everything is perfect except I wish she would stop her silent accusations. Her presence casts a shadow over my joy. William read further, his unease growing. Eleanor never named this mysterious she, but the references continued, becoming more frequent and more disturbing as the year progressed. October 10th, 1896. She approached me today, spoke to me for the first time. Her words made no sense, accusations about theft, about taking what wasn't mine. I tried to explain I had no idea what she meant, but she walked away laughing, a terrible hollow sound. December 20th, 1896. Only 4 days until Christmas. Mother is planning a magnificent dinner. The whole family will be here, including Thomas's parents. I should be excited, but I feel watched. Even in my own home, I sense her presence, as if she's waiting for something. The final entry, dated December 23rd, sent chills through William's body. Tomorrow is Christmas Eve. Mother says this will be our last Christmas as an unmarried woman. Next year, I'll celebrate with my own family. But tonight, I had the strangest dream. I was sitting at our dinner table, surrounded by loved ones, but I couldn't eat. My hand wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, watching everyone else enjoy the feast while I starved. And across from me, in the corner where the shadows gather, she stood watching, smiling. Tomorrow will be a beautiful day, I'm sure of it. I only wish I didn't feel this sense of impending something. I can't name it. Dread, perhaps, or is it merely pre-wedding jitters? Mother says I worry too much. Tomorrow will be perfect. There were no more entries. William showed the journal to his family that evening. They gathered in the parlor, the atmosphere heavy with growing dread. "We need to find out who this woman was," Catherine said, her voice trembling slightly. "The one Eleanor kept mentioning." James, who had been unusually quiet since sharing the story of Eleanor's death, finally spoke. "I might know. When I was researching the house's history, I found something else. Something I didn't mention because it seemed irrelevant." He pulled out a folded newspaper clipping from his pocket. "This is from 1895, a year before Eleanor died." The article described a local scandal. A woman named Vera Thompson had been engaged to Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's brother, not Eleanor's fiancé, but the engagement had been broken off suddenly. According to the report, Thomas Whitmore had ended the relationship after discovering Vera had been less than truthful about certain financial matters. The article hinted at debts and questionable business dealings involving Vera's family. "Thomas Whitmore married someone else 6 months later," James continued. "A woman from a respectable family with a substantial dowry. Vera Thompson was humiliated, publicly shamed. She filed a lawsuit claiming breach of promise but lost. After that, she mostly disappeared from society." "Except she didn't disappear entirely," William said slowly, understanding dawning. "She stayed in Rochester, watching the Whitmores, blaming them for her ruin." Margaret frowned. "But Eleanor wasn't even involved in Thomas's engagement. Why would this Vera Thompson focus her hatred on an innocent girl?" "Maybe because Eleanor's happiness highlighted everything Vera had lost," Catherine suggested quietly. "Eleanor was young, engaged, celebrating a bright future. Everything Vera would never have." The implications were becoming clearer and more disturbing. William turned back to Eleanor's journal, rereading the entries with new context. Vera Thompson had stalked Eleanor, approached her with accusations, and appeared in her dreams the night before her death. If you're still following this investigation, leave a comment with your theories. Don't forget to subscribe to catch the conclusion. William's next step was to locate any remaining information about Vera Thompson. The trail led him to the Rochester City Directory for 1896, which listed her address as a boarding house on South Avenue, a less affluent part of the city. The building still stood, though it had changed hands multiple times over the years. The current landlady, Mrs. Henshaw, was a stern woman in her 60s who maintained detailed records of all previous tenants. When William inquired about Vera Thompson, Mrs. Henshaw's expression turned cold. "That woman," she said with obvious distaste. "I was just a girl working for the previous owner when she lived here. Made everyone uncomfortable, she did. Always muttering to herself, burning strange herbs in her room. The other tenants complained constantly." "Do you know what happened to her?" William asked. Mrs. Henshaw nodded. "She took ill right after New Year's, 1897. Died within a week. Some kind of wasting disease the doctors couldn't identify. She refused all treatment, said she'd accomplished what she needed to and was ready to go." The landlady paused, her voice dropping. On her deathbed, she kept laughing, saying something about a Christmas dinner and how justice had finally been served. William felt his blood run cold. Vera Thompson had died less than 2 weeks after Eleanor's death, claiming some kind of victory. He needed more information. The public library's archives contained additional newspaper articles about Vera's death. One caught his attention, a brief mention that authorities had found several items of interest in Vera's room, including what the article delicately called implements of folk practices. Folk practices. In 1897, Rochester, that was code for something darker. Through a contact at the police department, a friend of his father's, William obtained access to the property inventory from Vera Thompson's room. The list was disturbing. Bundles of dried herbs, hand-drawn diagrams with strange symbols, several small dolls made of cloth and wax, and a journal filled with what the investigating officer described as recipes and instructions for various malevolent purposes. Poisoning wasn't mentioned explicitly, But reading between the lines, William understood. Vera Thompson had been practicing something. Whether folk magic, herbalism, or old-fashioned poisoncraft, the distinction hardly mattered. She'd been seeking revenge against the Whitmores, but had she succeeded? Eleanor's death certificate listed cardiac failure. The police investigation had found no evidence of poisoning. Yet the timing, Vera's obsession, and her deathbed claims all pointed towards something deliberately done. William returned home to find his family gathered in unusual tension. James had received a letter forwarded from his previous address out west. It was from the deceased conductor's widow, responding to inquiries James had made months ago. The letter contained a single paragraph that changed everything. "My husband mentioned your questions about the Whitmore house before he passed. He wanted you to know that he'd spoken with Ruth Whitmore years ago when she was dying in a sanatorium in Buffalo. She told him something she'd never told anyone else, that on Christmas Eve 1896, a package had arrived at their home. No return address, no card. Inside was a small tin of Eleanor's favorite tea blend. Eleanor had drunk a cup that afternoon while preparing for the dinner. Within hours, she was dead. Ruth always believed the tea had been poisoned, but she couldn't prove it. The police dismissed her claims as grief-induced paranoia. She died still convinced that someone had murdered her daughter and gotten away with it." The room fell silent. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "So Eleanor was poisoned. Vera Thompson killed her. But why would Eleanor's presence appear in our photograph?" Catherine asked. "If Vera was the murderer, shouldn't we see her hand instead?" William had been thinking about this. Perhaps because Eleanor's death was incomplete somehow. She died reaching for food she never ate, celebrating a Christmas she never finished. If any part of consciousness persists after death, and I'm not saying it does, maybe her last moment was so powerful, so focused on that interrupted dinner, that it somehow left an impression, like a photograph itself. Thomas added slowly, "A moment, frozen in time." James pulled out the Christmas photograph again, studying the mysterious hand. "There's something else. Look at the position. The hand isn't threatening. It's not grasping or clawing. It's just resting there, almost peacefully." William took the photograph, examining it closely. James was right. The hand appeared relaxed, natural, as if belonging to someone simply waiting to be served. There was nothing malevolent about it. "Maybe," Margaret said softly, "she's not haunting us. Maybe she just wanted to finish her Christmas dinner. We celebrated in the same room on the same night at what I imagine was the same time she died. Perhaps for one moment, the past and present aligned, and she was finally able to complete what was stolen from her." It was a gentle interpretation, one that brought a strange kind of peace to the family. They sat together in the parlor as afternoon faded to evening, each lost in their own thoughts about Eleanor Whitmore, a young woman whose only crime had been happiness, whose life had been stolen by jealousy and spite. William eventually broke the silence. "I've been thinking about what we should do with this information. We could go to the authorities, present evidence that Eleanor was murdered, but Vera Thompson is dead. The Whitmores are gone. Justice, in any legal sense, is impossible. Then what do we do?" Catherine asked. "We remember," William said simply. "We tell her story. We make sure Eleanor Whitmore isn't forgotten, that her death meant something beyond tragedy." The family agreed. They would document everything they'd learned, preserve Eleanor's journal, and ensure that future owners of the house knew its history, not to frighten them, but to honor the young woman who died there. As for the photograph, they decided to keep it, not hidden away in shame or fear, but displayed alongside other family pictures. A reminder that the past is never truly past, that the houses we inhabit carry the weight of all who came before. That night, William returned to his room and wrote a final entry in his investigation notes. "We may never know if the hand in our photograph was truly Eleanor Whitmore's, or merely a trick of chemistry and coincidence. But does it matter? A young woman died unjustly. Her story deserved to be told. Perhaps that's what she wanted all along. Not revenge, not to frighten us, but simply to be remembered. If so, then we've given her what she sought. May she rest in peace. The weeks following their investigation brought an unexpected peace to the Henderson household. It was as if uncovering Eleanor's story had released some tension that had been building since Christmas. The house felt lighter somehow, less heavy with unspoken things. William remained in Rochester through February, extending his leave from work. He spent his days writing a comprehensive account of everything they'd discovered about Eleanor Whitmore and Vera Thompson. The document grew to over 50 pages, meticulously detailed and carefully sourced. He planned to deposit a copy with the Rochester Historical Society, ensuring Eleanor's story would be preserved for future generations. Catherine helped him organize the materials, including Eleanor's journal, which they decided to donate to the Historical Society as well. She'd been the most affected by the investigation, having felt a strange kinship with Eleanor. Both women in their 20s, both planning spring weddings, both navigating the complex social expectations of their times. "Do you think she knows we found out what happened to her?" Catherine asked one afternoon as they worked together in the study. William considered the question carefully. "I don't know if consciousness persists after death, Kath, but if it does, if some part of Eleanor Whitmore is aware on any level, then yes, I'd like to think she knows. I'd like to think it brought her peace." The photograph remained where they'd placed it, on the parlor mantelpiece, displayed between a picture of Thomas and Margaret's wedding and one of the family from years earlier. Visitors occasionally noticed the extra hand and asked about it, giving the Hendersons opportunities to tell Eleanor's story. James returned to his work out west in early March, but he was different than before. The investigation had changed him, softened something that the railroads had hardened. He promised to write more regularly, to stay connected to family in ways he hadn't bothered with before. Confronting Eleanor's story, a tale of a life cut short, of dreams unfulfilled, had reminded him not to take his own time for granted. Margaret continued her neighborhood rounds, but with a new purpose. She collected stories from elderly residents, documenting the history of their street, the families who'd lived and died there. Rochester was growing rapidly, old houses being torn down and replaced with modern buildings. Someone needed to preserve the human stories before they disappeared entirely. Thomas, pragmatic as always, struggled most with what they'd discovered. He wanted concrete explanations, scientific validation, something more definitive than the ambiguous evidence they'd collected. Yet he couldn't deny what the photograph showed, couldn't explain away the coincidences that had led them to Eleanor's story. One evening in late March, as the last snow melted and early spring arrived, the family gathered for dinner, their first formal meal together since Christmas. They'd avoided using the dining room in the intervening months, taking meals in the kitchen or parlor instead, but it felt wrong to let fear dictate their use of their own home. Margaret had prepared a simple meal, nothing as elaborate as Christmas dinner. As they took their seats, William noticed his father staring at the spot where the mysterious hand had appeared in the photograph, the place where Eleanor Whitmore had died. "Should we say something?" Catherine asked quietly. "Some kind of acknowledgement?" Thomas cleared his throat. "I'm not a man given to superstition or sentiment, but if any part of Eleanor Whitmore is aware of us, I want to say this. We're sorry for what happened to you. Sorry that your life was stolen, that justice was never served, that your story was almost forgotten. We'll remember you. We'll make sure others remember you too. This house will honor your memory, not bury it." They sat in respectful silence for a moment. Then Margaret served the food, and they ate together, conversation flowing naturally. The room felt peaceful, warm. Whatever presence had made itself known on Christmas seemed satisfied now, content to rest. Over the following months, William completed his account and submitted it to the Rochester Historical Society. The curators were fascinated by Eleanor's story, and agreed to create a small exhibit about her life and mysterious death. Eleanor's journal, carefully preserved, became the centerpiece. The exhibit opened in June 1909, drawing modest but steady crowds. Local newspapers picked up the story, running articles about the Christmas mystery of 1896 and the family photograph that had brought it to light. Some readers dismissed it as fantasy. Others were intrigued by the combination of documented history and unexplained phenomena. William received letters from across the country, people sharing their own stories of mysterious photographs, unexplained occurrences, family histories that couldn't be fully explained. He realized Eleanor's story had touched something universal: the desire to be remembered, the fear that our lives might pass without meaning, the hope that death isn't quite the end. Catherine's wedding took place that spring as planned, a beautiful ceremony attended by family and friends. As she stood at the altar, she thought of Eleanor Whitmore, who never got to experience her own wedding day. Catherine made a silent promise that she'd live fully, appreciating each moment, never taking happiness for granted. The photograph remained in the Henderson parlor for decades. When Thomas and Margaret eventually passed, the house went to William, who kept it as a testament to family history, both his own and Eleanor's. He showed it to his children and eventually to his grandchildren, always telling Eleanor's story, making sure she was never forgotten. Did the hand in the photograph truly belong to Eleanor Whitmore? Was it evidence of something beyond our understanding of life and death? Or was it simply an extraordinary coincidence, a trick of chemistry and timing that happened to align with a tragic historical event? The Henderson family never reached a definitive conclusion. William, the scientist, remained skeptical but couldn't explain away what they'd documented. Margaret, more spiritually inclined, believed Eleanor had made her presence known to ensure her story would be told. Catherine thought perhaps the truth lay somewhere between, not supernatural intervention, but rather the way trauma and tragedy leave marks on places, creating thin spots where past and present touch. James, in Letters from Out West, offered perhaps the wisest perspective. Maybe it doesn't matter what we call it. A young woman died unjustly. We learned her story. We honored her memory. Whether the hand in that photograph is real or illusion, whether Eleanor's consciousness somehow persisted, or the whole thing is just chemistry and coincidence, it accomplished something good. It brought truth to light. Sometimes that's enough. Indeed, the photograph still exists today, preserved in the archives of the Rochester Historical Society. Modern skeptics have analyzed it extensively. Some claim to have found evidence of tampering. Others insist it's authentic. Digital enhancement and computer analysis have yielded conflicting results. The debate continues. But in the end, the photograph's authenticity matters less than what it represents. A reminder that every house has stories, every family photograph captures more than just faces, and the past is never as distant as we believe. Eleanor Whitmore's death was tragic and unjust. Her story, nearly forgotten, was preserved by chance and curiosity. The Henderson family gave her something Vera Thompson's poison couldn't take away: a legacy. Eleanor Whitmore is remembered not as a victim, but as a young woman who loved, who planned, who looked forward to her future. And perhaps, on one Christmas Eve in 1908, she was finally able to complete the dinner that had been interrupted 12 years earlier. Some mysteries don't need solutions. Some questions are more meaningful than answers. The hand in the 1908 Christmas photograph remains unexplained, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. In the space between knowing and not knowing, between science and faith, between past and present, Eleanor Whitmore's story lives on. And maybe, just maybe, that was her intention all along. The mystery of the 1908 Christmas photograph remains unsolved to this day. Was it Eleanor Whitmore reaching across time to complete her interrupted dinner? Was it an elaborate hoax, A trick of early photography, or something we simply don't have the language or science to explain? We may never know the truth, and perhaps that's what makes it so compelling. The Henderson family's investigation uncovered a forgotten tragedy and gave voice to a young woman whose story deserved to be told. Sometimes that's more important than definitive answers. What do you think really appeared in that photograph? Leave your theories in the comments below. I love reading your thoughts and responding to your ideas. If you enjoyed this deep dive into historical mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. There are countless untold stories waiting to be discovered, and I'll be bringing them to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.